Welcome back. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about the Caro-Kann defense, which is, as I've mentioned on this channel several times, it's the opening that I've been practicing as black when white plays e4. I play c6. That's the Caro-Kann defense. After that, there were many different second moves for white, pretty common second move for black, and then it branches out. And this is not a teaching video. For a disclaimer, but if you are brand new to the Caro-Kann, you might find some of this informative, but if you really want to study it, I suggest actually getting someone who's a titled player or well-versed in the Caro-Kann who's been playing it for years and study from them, or get a book or work on it with the analysis board on one of the popular websites. But what I'm going to do here is just show what I've learned so far. Now, this is what it looks like on the board after we've played c6. White has a bunch of second moves, so that's a kind of a benefit for white here, is that there's a lot of things that they can do that aren't really dangerous to them. Knight to c3, knight to f3, bishop to c4, which is known as the hillbilly attack. The most common is d4, but I have also seen c4, and I've even seen f4. Very rarely I will see queen to f3 here. But to all of those, we just have to remember to play d5. That's the best move for black on the second move, almost no matter what white does. Now there are going to be a few oddball players that you face, I guess, and they're going to play something weird that I haven't looked at yet or I haven't faced yet. But to all the common second moves by white, our second move will be d5. And I'm going to show you what most of those common ones are. Okay, to bring the chart back up, I have here added the 6 most common continuations of the Caro-Kann when we get to move 2. You will see at the upper left, white plays d4 and we play d5. That is about half, according to the Lichess Players Database and according to my own experience of logging my own games, about half of all continuations of the Caro-Kann. The second move for white is d4. Now, over at the upper right on this graph, knight to f3. That's the second most common second move by white, and that's about half of the remainder. So between those two, that's 3/4 of all instances of the Caro-Kann. Now we get increasingly less common. We see knight c3. I see bishop to c4, which is the hillbilly attack, quite a bit at my level. That's the 4th most common. And then the 2 at the bottom, I almost never see. And if you look at the Lichess Players Database or any other databases, those are pretty uncommon, but they're the 5th and 6th most common moves. Now, as you'll notice, I've already included d5 as black's second move in all of those because, as I've said, that's going to be the second move pretty much no matter what they do. After that, again, white has options, and then the branches start branching out for black. Let's take a look. Okay, here's the same chart with those same 6 second moves by white and black, but then with further branches that pop out from there. And as you can see, there are quite a few choices. After we play d5, whatever white has played on their first move, after we play d5, they have other options. Now in the most common one, which is again at the upper left, d4 and d5, then white sometimes plays knight to d2, sometimes knight to c3. Those are the main line and the modern variation. Sometimes they take our d5 pawn. That's the exchange variation. Sometimes they advance their e-pawn past it. And that's the advanced variation. Sometimes they play f3. That's the fantasy variation. And there are other third moves for white too, but then, again, those are increasingly less common, and we really don't have to worry about it. Okay, now what those all arise from this position here, which is again at least half of the games that I've ever faced with the Caro-Kann. And once I've played d5, the most common that I think that I face is at least as I was lower. This is becoming less common now, but the exchange variation was very common early on. White would just take that pawn, and when they do, we take back. Increasingly, I'm seeing the advanced variation, which white pushes this pawn forward, so there's no longer this tension between e4 and d5. Now, in that case, black has options, as you saw in the chart. There is c5, which directly attacks this pawn and invites it to take. There's bishop to f5, which delays that just a little bit, but it gets this bishop out so that then we can play e6 to block the advance of their e-pawn. and that opens up our dark squared bishop to protect the c-pawn moving forward. Okay, that's the advanced variation. The fantasy variation is when they play f3 here. I haven't faced that very often, maybe 2 or 3 times. And I think my best move is just to take this, and then they generally take back, but again, haven't faced that enough to have really studied it yet. Another thing that I see here is white just leaves those pawns there, and we leave these pawns here. This is the main line. This is the modern variation. Now, both of those often turn into the same thing. They transpose back into each other because here I will take their e-pawn and they will take back. So it didn't matter whether they placed their knight on c3 or d2 because it's going to end up here in exchange for our d and those 2 pawns anyway. Very often when that happens, we will bring bishop to f5. They'll drop this knight back here, attacking our bishop. We drop our bishop back here. And at this point, I usually see knight to f3, getting both their knights out, and then of course they're preparing to castle once they move their bishop. Sometimes here I see h4, which is one of the common things, and then I usually play h6 in order to have a place to hide my bishop before that pawn can get down there and directly attack me. But all of these moves have a reason behind them, as you saw. As we back up, from the very beginning, the whole idea of playing c6 is to defend e5, and that's easy to remember, at least for me. I can memorize 2 or 3 moves in a row, but it's much easier to memorize much longer lines if I know the reason why. And I know the reason why I play this is to defend e5. So now I know to play d5 because that was the reason we played this. And if they advance, I know one of the reasons right now to play this is otherwise it's going to get trapped behind this pawn. So we want to get the light squared bishop out. And I know that if I choose to play c5 instead, that the reason for that is to distract this d pawn. And then, of course, we'll play the e pawn and take it back with our dark squared bishop. But as you see, each one of these moves has a reason, so that makes it easier for me to remember. So I get this out so it doesn't get trapped. It's a good reason. Also, it's relatively safe right now. And here, white has different options. Sometimes they will put this bishop right here, and if so, that bishop was about to be trapped anyway, and it's about to be blockaded by my own pawns. My own pawns are protecting all the light squares, so I feel like I can trade off this bishop here for that reason. And I take it, and they take back, and then we play e6 to complete this little defensive pawn chain and to open up our dark squared bishop in order to get it out. Although, I also know that because this pawn guards f6, and we can't put our knight on f6 like we normally do, so sometimes, before getting the dark squared bishop, say to here, we would want to get this knight out, and then up there, then get the dark squared bishop out. Very occasionally, we will want to get this out now, but usually not, because that just helps white complete their pawn chain. So anyway, as you can see, each one of these moves has a reason, and let's take a look at that chart one more time. Okay, now I'm going to add on even further variations to these. Okay, as you can see, I've spent some time on this, but this chart was more fun for me than anything else, but also it's a visual representation of how many branches that there are after just a few moves. You can see already that most of these haven't gone out past move 3 or 4. There's a few of them that go out to move 5 or 6. You'll see that the 2 knights attack, I have taken that out to move 6. The knight to f3 version, we've taken it out to move 5 in a couple of cases. And the advanced variation, Botvinnik Karl's defense, I've taken out to move 5. But already you see how many possibilities that there are going to be after just 4 or 5 moves. And one thing and there's more than this, but one thing I've already noticed just from logging my games is I've never reached the same position by move 6. And I've played this opening almost 200 times now, but by move 6, I'm at a completely unique position. Now, sometimes they're very similar because so many of them start off the same way. I've reached the exact position shown on the board here several times already, but this is only move 5. And then here, white has a couple of different options, and as I've said, we have different options as well, sometimes here, and then this knight goes out that way. Sometimes we want to put our queen here to aim at that pawn if they decide to bring their bishop out at this point. But that's going to be the case for any opening. Was my point here, is that any opening, whether you play d4 or e4 as white, whether you respond with e5 as black, or the Sicilian, or the Scandinavian, or the Caro-Kann, then white has options at that point, and black has options at that point, and it begins to branch and branch further and further. And so I just made this graphic organizer or bubble map, whatever you want to call it, to just kind of show how many possibilities that there are just 4 or 5 moves out. But again, one of the awesome things for me about the Caro-Kann is that each one of these moves has a reason, has a purpose, and that makes them easier to remember. So I don't feel like I'm memorizing lines. I feel like I'm doing things with a purpose. I'm playing defensively, and usually can get to an equal position depending on what white plays and whether or not I remember the reasons in which moves. Usually get an equal position by move 8. Sometimes it takes till move 10 or 12 to get the equal position. Sometimes it takes till move 15 or 16 before I can castle, because as you saw, right now I'm going to have trouble getting this knight out to its normal square. Sometimes I have to move it here and here first, so that's an extra move that you wouldn't always have to make. But again, know the reasons behind the moves. Now, if some of you who do know the Caro-Kann were looking at this chart and noticed that I missed a couple of options, I didn't miss them, I just chose not to put them in there. For white, I just put the things that I've seen most often, and for black, I've put the things that I've played most often. But for almost every step in here, both sides have other options that, besides those that are listed, that aren't that bad. Especially, I've noticed, for white. There's a lot of places in the Caro-Kann that white can make just about any move and be okay. Won't lose a significant amount of their advantage. It might bump them back from, say, 0.5 to 0, but they're still within the range of equality. But I've just left off some of those moves. But if you've looked through a certain part of this graph, which, by the way, I will have a link to in the description to a full-size version of this, if you've noticed a spot where you see that I've listed several moves in a row, like with the 2 knights attack, I've listed after knight to c3 or knight to f3, I've listed d captures e4, knight captures e4, knight to f6, knight captures f6 check, e captures f6, d4, and then bishop to d6. That's just a very common line in the 2 knights attack, but it's not the only choice for either player at any of those spots. And if you say, well, he left out this move, well, that move has been played. Somebody will play that move. But in order to keep the chart as simple as it is, which is a little bit of a joke because it's very complex already, but it would have been much more complex if I had included every possible variation. But anyway, that's where I've gotten so far with the Caro-Kann. One thing that I learned from Gotham Chess when I took the Caro-Kann course was that you really can't learn an opening. You can't internalize it or get good at it until you've played it many hundreds of times, if not many thousands of times. And so I'm not there yet. As I said, I haven't even reached identical positions after move 6 or 7. And so there's no point in memorizing anything beyond that because my opponents and me, neither one, are getting to those book moves out that far. So I'm playing it more and more often. Sometimes I deviate from the book, from the path, because I don't remember exactly what I was supposed to do in that situation. And I'm thinking, wait, I need to get this piece out, but that piece can't go there. But my time is ticking. I have to make a decision, but I'm getting there. And I do plan on playing this more and more. Like I said, I'm almost at 200 games right now. And another thing I wanted to mention about the Caro-Kann for me is that I haven't yet broke even. I've still lost more games than I've won with the Caro-Kann. But I think that's going to be normal, especially if I'm playing people who play 10 to 20 games a day, and I'm playing 2 or 3 games a day tops, and they've been playing online for years, and I've only been playing online for less than 2 years. They've seen the Caro-Kann, and also they've been doing these tactics for years. I've only been training for so many months. So I didn't expect to start winning with it right away. But I do notice that I'm getting close. I'm close to breaking even with it. I'm at about 46%, I think, with my win rate, and I hope to get to 50% before too long. And again, If you aren't familiar with this and you're curious, feel free to download the chart, which I will link to in the description. Take a look at the branches. But I much more recommend looking at the analysis board, Stockfish, on one of the major websites, or looking through the Lichess Opening Explorer, or actually diving into a Caro-Kann course with someone who's qualified to teach it. I'm not teaching the Caro-Kann course here. I'm just showing what I've learned so far and the way that I'm thinking about it. If you have any advice or questions, feel free to drop them in the comments. As always, thank you for watching. Thank you for your support.